the mysterious lighthouse. It was a night like many others in London. The fog rolled in, dense and cloying, swallowing the familiar landmarks of the city in its white embrace. Trees, slick with the sheen of rain from earlier, reflected the flickering glow of the gas lamps, casting long, uneven shadows on the cobblestones. Chapter 1. The air was heavy with the smell of coal fires and damp earth, and in the distance, the muted clatter of carriage wheels on stone echoed faintly, their wheels disappearing into the mist like lost voices from another time. I had just returned to Baker Street, my heart longing for the quietude of our rooms after a day spent in the hospital's wards. The familiar hum of the city outside did little to soothe my weary mind, but I knew that nothing could quite calm me like the quiet of our shared space until, of course, Holmes decided otherwise. As I opened the door to our apartment, the familiar scent of tobacco and the sharp aroma of unwashed coats filled the air. Holmes was seated at his desk, hunched over a stack of letters. The glow from the single lamp on the table painted his face in strange half-light, emphasizing the sharpness of his features. He was muttering to himself, barely aware of my arrival, which was not uncommon for Holmes. "Watson," he said, without lifting his head, his voice low and measured. "You've arrived just in time." I paused in the doorway, not yet fully accustomed to the strangeness of the scene. I knew, of course, that Holmes had a way of working himself into a frenzy over the smallest details, but the sight of him in such an absorbed state, late in the evening, suggested something out of the ordinary. "Holmes," I asked, my curiosity rising, "what is it?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued, turning over the paper in his hands, his fingers skimming over the lines of text with a quickness that betrayed both his agitation and his fascination. Finally, his eyes met mine, and the familiar gleam of intrigue flashed within them. "I've received a letter, Watson," he said, "from a man named Elias Cartwright. He is the keeper of a lighthouse on the southern coast, near a place called Hartscombe. He asks for our help." I raised an eyebrow. My interest piqued, but I couldn't mask my skepticism. A lighthouse keeper. What could possibly bring you to take interest in the plight of someone who tends to the light at the edge of the world? Holmes gave me a slight smile, almost as if he had been expecting my reaction. "It's not the lighthouse, Watson, but what happens there, or rather, what doesn't happen there, that has caught my attention." The letter, which Holmes passed to me, was composed in neat, hurried handwriting. It spoke of strange occurrences, whispers coming from the sea, lights flickering in the lighthouse at night when the tower was empty, and shadows that appeared in the windows despite no one being there. Most bizarre of all, the letter described phantom footsteps in the sand, leading out to the ocean, only to vanish without a trace. Whispers from the sea, shadows in the lighthouse, disappearing footprints. I echoed, letting the absurdity of it sink in. "It sounds like superstition, Holmes. Perhaps we should leave it to the locals to deal with their hauntings." Holmes raised an eyebrow, a look of disdain crossing his face at my dismissive tone. "There is nothing superstitious about this case, Watson. I have a hunch that there is something far more sinister at play." Something. He paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment, that defies reason. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as Holmes spoke, the quiet of Baker Street suddenly filling thick with unspoken anticipation. Holmes' certainty was always a powerful thing. Though I didn't yet know it, his words would prove true. "We leave for Hartscombe tomorrow," he added briskly, his tone final. "Prepare yourself for a journey, Watson. The sea is calling." We arrived in Hartscombe the following morning, the weather still overcast and thick with mist. The village sat precariously at the edge of the sea, its white cottages built on narrow streets that wound their way toward the cliff's edge. The ocean roared with an unnatural force, the waves crashing against jagged rocks below, sending up bursts of spray. There was something almost oppressive about the place. The village felt like a place lost to time, forgotten by the world, yet bound to the eternal rhythm of the sea. The lighthouse, visible from the village, stood like a sentry on a distant promontory, its tall, stoic shape silhouetted against the churning gray sky. The structure seemed to loom over the village, as if watching, waiting. I could understand why the locals might feel a sense of unease when it stood so close to their small homes. A solitary sentinel in a landscape full of shifting shadows and secrets. We made our way toward the lighthouse, our carriage creaking, as we rolled over the uneven path that led toward the cliff's edge. As we approached, a figure emerged from the shadows, his tall, thin frame almost ghostly against the rising mist. This was Elias Cartwright, the lighthouse keeper. His face was drawn and pale, his clothes weathered and worn. There were dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. When he extended his hand to us, his grip was firm but trembling. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us, his voice rough. "Thank you for coming. I am afraid there is no time to waste." I studied the man closely, taking in the look of quiet desperation in his eyes. It was clear that whatever was happening at the lighthouse was affecting him deeply. He seemed as though he might break at any moment. "Please, Mr. Cartwright," Holmes said, his voice calm and steady, "explain to us what has been happening." "I'm here to help." Cartwright hesitated, looking over his shoulder as though expecting someone or something to be watching. "It started about 3 months ago. At first, we thought it was just the wind or the tides playing tricks on us. The sounds, they weren't like the usual calls of the sea. They were voices, whispers, calling from out there," he said, gesturing toward the vast expanse of water. I found myself unsettled by the man's words. He spoke with a sense of conviction that hinted at the truth of his claim. Holmes, as usual, gave no sign of surprise, only a look of intense concentration. "And these whispers?" he asked. "Can you describe them further? What did they say?" Cartwright's gaze darkened as he looked back at the lighthouse. "I don't know, Mr. Holmes. It's difficult to say. At first, it was just noises, like murmuring voices in the wind. Over time, they grew louder, clearer. I swear, they're coming from the sea itself. And then there were the footsteps." "Footsteps?" I asked, my interest piqued on the sand. "Yes," Cartwright replied. "They appear each night, leading out toward the water. I've seen them myself, as have the others. But by the time we get close, they're gone, as if the sea has swallowed them up." Holmes nodded slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. "I see. And have you or anyone else noticed anything unusual within the lighthouse itself? Any oddities that might give us a clue?" Cartwright's expression faltered. "Lights flicker at all hours of the night, Mr. Holmes, even when the tower is empty. And there's something else. A figure in the window, moving, but when we go inside to investigate, there's no one there. It's driving us mad. I fear for my staff's safety." Holmes gave a decisive nod, signaling that we would begin our investigation immediately. His eyes gleamed with excitement, a sign that he had already begun to piece together the puzzle. "We will investigate the lighthouse tonight," Holmes said with quiet authority. "But, Mr. Cartwright, you must understand that we will observe everything. And you must remain open to all possibilities, no matter how strange they may seem." Cartwright gave a slight bow, his body stiff with both fear and anticipation. "Do anything, Mr. Holmes. I must stop this before it's too late." The fog had thickened by the time we approached the lighthouse, and the air was cold with the promise of a storm. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below seemed to intensify, and I could feel the tension in the air, as though something unseen was waiting for us. Holmes, with his usual air of calm, strode ahead, while I lingered a few steps behind, my thoughts turning toward the strange occurrences that have been described. Whispers from the sea, flickering lights, and disappearing footprints shit seemed a thing of legend or superstition. But in Holmes' world, nothing was too bizarre to warrant investigation. And as we entered the lighthouse's shadow, I knew this would not be a simple case. Something far deeper, far darker, was at play. Her aunt, the sea, was hiding its secrets, just waiting to be uncovered. The lighthouse mystery unfolds. The heavy door of the lighthouse creaked ominously as Holmes and I entered, the musty scent of old wood and brine filling the air. It was as though we had crossed a threshold into another world, one where time itself had been paused by the relentless pounding of the ocean outside. The walls, damp and worn, held no warmth against the chill that seemed to seep through the very stone. The faint hum of the wind, howling through the cracks in the tower's foundation, echoed in the silence, making it seem as though the lighthouse itself were alive, breathing in sync with the restless sea. Cartwright led us through the narrow, spiraling staircase that wound upward toward the light room, his footsteps echoing heavily against the stone. He walked with a peculiar hesitation, as though every step he took was weighed down by the fear he had not yet shed. Holmes, ever the figure of quiet confidence, moved with his usual surety, his keen eyes darting about the room, absorbing the details. I could see that his mind was already at work, unraveling the scene around us with the precision of a watchmaker. When we reached the top, we found ourselves in the heart of the lighthouse, the lantern room, the massive glass lens which would normally cast a reassuring beam of light out across the sea, storm its mechanism still and silent. The room, despite its grandeur, had an air of neglect. The thick layers of dust on the floor and the grime on the windows spoke of a place that had been abandoned in spirit, though it was clearly still in use. Holmes moved toward the window, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sea, ever-changing, roared with an intensity that matched the tension in the air. The fog, which had seemed to thicken as we approached the lighthouse, now hung heavily over the waters, blurring the line between the sea and the sky. It was a scene that could easily drive a man mad, I thought, as the gray expanse seemed to stretch endlessly, offering no anchor for the mind. "Is it always this quiet?" Holmes asked, his voice slicing through the silence. The winds seemed to have died down. Cartwright nodded, his face pinched with concern. "It is rare for the wind to fall so suddenly, especially this close to the cliff. But tonight, it's unnerving, Mr. Holmes. The air is still, as though the sea itself is holding its breath." I turned to look out over the sea, the emptiness of the night pressing down on me. There was something about the way the fog lingered over the waters that made my skin crawl. I could almost imagine the whispers Cartwright had spoken of, the faint murmurings carried on the wind just beyond the range of human understanding. But my mind quickly pushed the thought aside. There was nothing but sea and sky. Holmes, however, seemed undeterred. His eyes narrowed, and I could see that he was already considering the details, assessing the atmosphere with his usual ruthless precision. After a few moments, he turned to Cartwright. "Have you ever experienced anything unusual in this room? Anything beyond the usual occurrences?" Cartwright shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his hands together. "The lights have been flickering, Mr. Holmes, and sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps, not from below, but above, in the tower itself. But when I go to investigate, there is no one there." "Footsteps?" I asked, my brow furrowing. "In a place like this, who could be moving about?" Cartwright's eyes darted to the purse. Shadows in the corners of the room, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That's the thing, Dr. Watson. I've heard them too, so have the others. They move across the floor as though someone is pacing. But when we go up to check, the place is always empty. Always." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Strange." "Me, Mr. Cartwright, when these noises occurred, do they happen at regular intervals, or are they more erratic?" "They've been erratic, Mr. Holmes," Cartwright replied. "Sometimes at night, sometimes in the early morning, just as the dawn is breaking. It's never at the same time." Holmes stood silently for a moment, absorbing the information. Seemed to be lost in thought, his eyes scanning every inch of the room, still searching for some hidden sign that would unlock the mystery. I watched him, knowing that once his mind was set upon something, it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Suddenly, Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I suggest we conduct our investigation in the immediate area. Cartwright, I'd like you to remain here and observe. Perhaps the silence will reveal something we've missed." I nodded and moved toward the staircase leading down to the lower levels of the lighthouse, where the keeper's quarters and storage rooms were located. The air grew colder as I descended, the walls now feeling damp to the touch. There was something oppressive about the place, as though the very stone was absorbing the dread that seemed to hang in the air. The further I went, the more I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me. Each footstep seemed to echo through the centuries. I reached the first floor of the lighthouse, a simple room cluttered with supplies. It was clear that the space was used for storage, though it seemed oddly untouched. Boxes and crates sat in neat rows, their contents wrapped in old canvas. I made my way to the farthest corner of the room, where a small wooden table stood against the wall, its surface covered with old, yellowed papers. As I reached for the papers, I heard a soft creaking from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floor above. My heart quickened, and I instinctively looked toward the stairs, but when I reached the landing, no one was there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, but there was no sign of life. I returned to the main room, where Holmes was now examining a peculiar object on the floor, a small stone, dark as jet, partially embedded in the dirt. He held it up, turning it over in his hands, as though it were a clue to a much larger puzzle. "This is curious," Holmes remarked, inspecting the stone closely. "I would expect such a thing to be washed ashore, but this seems deliberate, as if someone wanted it left here." I leaned closer, scrutinizing the stone. It was small, almost unremarkable, except for the faint markings etched into its surface. They were worn smooth from years of exposure to the elements, but still, faint traces of symbols or characters were visible. It was as though someone had carved something into the stone, only to have time erase most of it. "Do you think it's connected to the whispers, Holmes?" I asked, my voice low. Holmes considered the stone for a moment, his eyes narrowing in thought. "It is entirely possible, but for now, let us not jump to conclusions. This stone, much like the footsteps, may be a part of a larger puzzle, one that we have yet to fully unravel." I nodded, though the unease in my stomach continued to grow. The stone was but a fragment of the mystery that seemed to seep through every crack in this place, a clue leading to more questions than answers. Holmes, sensing my growing uncertainty, turned back toward the lantern room. "Let us return upstairs, Watson. I believe our investigation is far from over, and perhaps the next step will be to speak with the others. Cartwright's staff may hold more answers than we've been led to believe." As we climbed the staircase once again, I couldn't help but feel that the dark sea outside, this endless whispers, was just the beginning. Something far more dangerous, more insidious, was hidden beneath the surface, and we had only scratched the edge of the mystery. Chapter 2. The Keeper's Secrets. The wind outside had picked up. The sea and the relentless roar of the waves below now seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the lighthouse. The eerie sound was constant, like a great beast growling in the distance, its presence felt but unseen. Inside the lighthouse, there was a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as though the world beyond the stone walls had been shut out entirely. It was a silence that pressed in on us, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. Holmes and I returned to the lantern room, where Cartwright awaited us. His expression was still one of palpable anxiety, but now there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. It was a flicker of guardedness, a subtle tightness around his mouth that made me wonder if there was more to his fear than he was willing to share. Holmes, of course, noticed it too. He turned his sharp gaze toward Cartwright, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You seem troubled, Mr. Cartwright, more so than when we first arrived." Cartwright stiffened, his gaze dropping to the floor as though he were afraid to meet Holmes's eyes. "I am not sure what you mean, Mr. Holmes," he stammered, clearly uncomfortable under Holmes's intense scrutiny. "Perhaps you're not, Mr. Cartwright," Holmes replied smoothly, "but something is weighing on your mind. I've seen the way you hesitate when you speak, the way you avoid certain topics. I can only assume there is something more you're not telling us." For a moment, there was a silence between us, the only sound the distant crash of the waves below. Cartwright's eyes flickered nervously toward the window, his lips parting as though he were about to speak, but then the words faltered on his belt tongue. He seemed to be wrestling with something, as though debating whether or not to reveal the truth. At last, Cartwright sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his secret had become too much to bear. "I've been afraid to speak about it," he confessed, his voice low. "Afraid it would sound mad, but I suppose there's no hiding it any longer." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "What is it, Mr. Cartwright? You've heard the footsteps?" "Yes." But there is something more, isn't there?" Cartwright looked at him, his face drawn with weariness. "There's something in this lighthouse? Something. I don't know what it is. I've felt it for months now. It's the first time I noticed it. I was in the tower alone, late at night. I heard the footsteps, just like I always do. But this time, they were different. They weren't just the sound of someone walking. They were heavier, like the steps of someone, something that was too large to be human." I could see Holmes's attention sharpening, the way his mind was already beginning to work through the possibilities. He gestured for Cartwright to continue. "It was that night," Cartwright said, "that I saw something that I can't explain. It was brief, just a shadow, really. It moved across the far wall of the lantern room, quick as a flash. But when I turned, there was no one there, just the empty room. I thought maybe I was seeing things, or perhaps I was just tired. But the next night, the same thing happened, and the night after that." Holmes was silent for a moment, contemplating the new information. His fingers drummed lightly on the arm of the chair as he absorbed the details. "And you never mentioned this to anyone else?" Holmes asked, his voice calm, though I could tell his mind was racing. "I couldn't," Cartwright replied, shaking his head. "I knew they'd think I was losing my mind, and I didn't want to frighten the others, so I kept it to myself." Holmes nodded slowly, as if the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. "And these shadows, these movements they confined to the lantern room?" Cartwright shook his head. "No, I've seen them in other parts of the lighthouse too. Sometimes they're fleeting, almost imperceptible, but other times they're more definite. It's like someone or something watching me." "Is there any part of the lighthouse you haven't explored fully?" Holmes asked, his gaze narrowing slightly. Cartwright hesitated, his lips pressing together, as though the question stirred something buried deep inside him. "There's one place," he said softly. "The lower cellar. It's where we keep the spare oil and maintenance tools. I haven't gone down there in a while. The door's heavy, and the place has always felt wrong, for lack of a better word." "Wrong," I echoed, raising an eyebrow. Cartwright nodded, his expression shadowed. "There's an odd smell down there, something like rotting wood, but it's not the dampness of the place. And sometimes, when I'm near the door, I hear things, scraping noises, as if something or someone is moving around inside." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who looked as though he had just uncovered a new layer to the mystery. "Perhaps that's a place we should investigate," Holmes said quietly, his voice tinged with both curiosity and caution. "There may be a clue hidden there, one that will explain what's truly happening in this lighthouse." Cartwright looked hesitant, his face contorting in doubt. I don't know if that's such a good idea. I've tried to ignore it, Mr. Holmes. Whatever's down there, it feels unnatural. It's not something I want to confront." Holmes leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "I understand your reluctance, Mr. Cartwright, but if we are to solve this mystery, we must leave no stone unturned. The cellar may hold the answers we seek. If you could show us the way, I believe we will uncover the truth." After a long pause, Cartwright nodded, though the fear in his eyes was palpable. He stood and led us down a narrow hallway to a door at the end, its edges worn from years of use. The smell hit us immediately, musty, decaying scent that seemed to seep through the wood itself. Cartwright paused, taking a deep breath before he slowly turned the handle. The cellar was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from the low ceiling. The air inside was thick and stale, and the walls were lined with shelves stacked with crates and barrels. But it was the far corner of the room that caught my attention. There, hidden beneath a pile of old tarpaulins, was a large, heavy chest, its lid slightly ajar. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his hand hovering near the chest. He paused, clearly considering the implications. "Mr. Cartwright," he said quietly, "is this chest yours?" Cartwright hesitated, his face growing pale. "No, I've never seen it before." Holmes's gaze shifted to me, and I could see the unmistakable glimmer of realization in his eyes. "It appears we have found another clue, Watson, and I suspect this chest may hold the key to understanding what has been happening in this lighthouse." I felt a sudden chill, as if the air in the cellar had grown colder still. Cartwright, visibly shaken, stepped back, his eyes wide with fear. "Please, Mr. Holmes," he said in a hoarse whisper, "whatever is in that chest, it's better left undisturbed." Holmes, however, was undeterred. He stepped forward, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he opened the chest. Chapter 3. The secrets beneath the chest creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo through the cellar, its heavy lid lifting reluctantly as if trying to protect whatever lay hidden within. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a mixture of curiosity and determination. And I found myself instinctively holding my breath, as if the air itself were thick with anticipation. Inside the chest, there was no treasure, no gleaming jewels or valuables as I had imagined. Instead, the contents were far more peculiar. A pile of old, yellowed papers, tattered and frayed at the edges, and a set of objects wrapped in a faded, moth-eaten cloth. Holmes carefully lifted the cloth, revealing a collection of strange, intricately carved stones, smooth and black, with symbols etched into their surfaces. I stepped closer to inspect them, my curiosity piqued. The stones were unlike anything I had ever seen before. Their smooth, almost polished surfaces seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light of the lantern. The symbols carved into them were formed to elaborate, twisting shapes that seemed to dance before my eyes. The longer I stared at them, the more unsettled I became, as though the very markings were shifting and changing beneath my gaze. Holmes, as ever, seemed unperturbed by the strange objects. He reached for one of the stones and turned it over in his hands, studying the markings with a concentrated intensity. "These are not of local origin," he murmured. "They appear to be part of an ancient tradition, perhaps even linked to some long-lost cult or civilization." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I found myself glancing nervously toward Cartwright, the lighthouse keeper, whose face had gone pale at the sight of the chest's contents. Now stood several feet back, his hand trembling as it rested on the cellar door frame. His expression was a mixture of fear and resignation, as though he knew he could no longer escape the truth. "I told you," he whispered, his voice low and strained. I told you, this place was cursed. There's something wrong with these stones. Unnatural. Holmes looked up, his eyes flicking to Cartwright with the same calm, measured gaze he always wore when faced with a mystery. Cursed, you say? Tell me, Mr. Cartwright, do you know where these stones came from? Cartwright shook his head, his face drawn with fear. No, I never saw them until I found them in the cellar. Okay, they were wrapped in that cloth, hidden deep in the back of the storage room. Okay, I thought they were just old relics at first, but when I touched them, he trailed off, his words faltering as he shuddered involuntarily. I felt something, Mr. Holmes, something dark, when I started hearing the whispers. The whispers, I repeated, piecing the details together. The voices you heard coming from the sea. Cartwright nodded grimly. Yes, I thought they were just the wind or the isolation getting to me. But every time I'd hear them, they seemed to come closer. I tried to ignore them, but the more I did, the louder they got. I couldn't escape it. And then, the shadows began. Holmes, who had been absorbed in his examination of the stones, looked up sharply at the mention of shadows. Shadows. Cartwright swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, moving across the walls, following me. I'd see them in the lantern room, in the halls. Always, just out of the corner of my eye. I thought I was losing my mind, but now, looking at these stones, I'm not so sure anymore. There was a long silence as Holmes continued to examine the stones, his brow furrowed in thought. I could sense the wheels turning in his mind, working through the connections, piecing together the mystery in his usual deliberate manner. Finally, he looked up at Cartwright. I believe these stones are the key to understanding what's happening here, Holmes said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. But we must find out more. Where did you find them, exactly? In the storage room, Cartwright repeated, his voice tight with unease. But there's something else, Mr. Holmes. These stones, they weren't the only thing hidden down there. There's a book. It was buried beneath some crates, as though someone wanted to keep it out of sight. Holmes's eyes gleamed with renewed interest. A book? What sort of book? I don't know, Cartwright replied, shaking his head. I haven't dared touch it. I've been afraid. But it's there, behind the crates. You can see it for yourself. Without hesitation, Holmes stood, his mind already working ahead of him. Lead the way, Mr. Cartwright. The lighthouse keeper hesitated for a moment, then nodded and turned toward the cellar door. We followed him through the dark, narrow hallway to the storage room at the back. The air in here was even thicker, the smell of damp wood and decay more pronounced. The walls were lined with shelves stacked high with old crates, and I could see now that many of them were covered in thick layers of dust, as though they had not been touched in years. Cartwright moved to one of the far corners and pointed to a spot behind a stack of crates. There, he said. It's buried under that pile. Holmes wasted no time in pulling the crates aside. The book was large, its cover bound in dark, weathered leather. The edges were frayed, and the pages, though yellowed with age, seemed to shimmer faintly, as though the book itself were somehow alive. Holmes ran his fingers gently over the cover, his eyes narrowing as he studied it carefully. It appears to be quite old, he said, almost to himself, perhaps even centuries old. The binding is unusual, and the pages feel strangely light. I stepped closer, my own curiosity rising. What does it say, Holmes? Holmes flipped the book open carefully, revealing a set of pages covered in a dense script writing, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was a flowing, almost artistic form of calligraphy, written in a language I didn't recognize. The symbols on the pages matched those on the stones, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I began to make the connection. This is a ritual, Holmes murmured, his fingers tracing the lines of text. A ritual that is not meant to be understood by modern minds. But these symbols, they match those on the stones. I suspect this book holds the key to whatever dark force is tied to the lighthouse." Cartwright's face had gone even paler, and he stepped back, his voice trembling. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew it wasn't just the wind. These stones. This book, it's all connected to something older, something darker. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. But now I see that it's been here, waiting." Holmes closed the book gently and looked up at Cartwright. "We must learn what these symbols mean, Mr. Cartwright. Only then will we understand how to stop whatever force has taken hold of this place." For the first time, I could see the full weight of the fear that had gripped Cartwright. He nodded silently, as though the realization of what we were dealing with had finally sunk in. The darkness, it seemed, was not just a metaphor. It was a very real presence, and it was connected to this ancient, cryptic book. "Then, what must we do, Mr. Holmes?" Cartwright asked, his voice barely audible. "We begin by deciphering this book," Holmes said, his voice firm. "We must understand the ritual, and then only then can we put an end to whatever is haunting this lighthouse." As Holmes closed the book and tucked it under his arm, I could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on us. The whispers from the sea, the shadows in the lighthouse, the strange symbols on the stones, they were all part of something much larger, something far more dangerous than I had anticipated. And now, as the storm outside raged, I knew that the true nature of this case was about to unfold in ways we had yet to imagine. The binding ritual of the storm outside had reached its crescendo. The wind howled like a wild beast, rattling the windows of the lighthouse, while the rain hammered against the stone walls, as if trying to tear the very structure apart. Yet, within the walls of the lighthouse, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension, one that had been building ever since we had uncovered the ancient book in the strange stones. Holmes, Cartwright, and I stood in the lantern room, where the air felt charged, as though we were about to perform some unholy ritual. The lantern room had never looked more desolate. The storm outside cast dark shadows across the room. In the beam of the lighthouse's light, which had once guided ships safely to shore, it now seemed strangely ominous as it swept across the churning sea. Holmes had set the stones in a precise pattern on the floor, each one resting on a circle marked with the choker reflection of the diagram in the book. I glanced at Cartwright, who stood beside me, his face pale with fear. His hands trembled, and I could see the weight of his apprehension in his eyes. He had never asked for this, never sought out whatever force had been awakened in the lighthouse, but now it seemed there was no turning back. "Holmes," I said quietly, my voice almost lost amidst the storm's fury, "how exactly do you intend to reverse the ritual?" Holmes did not immediately respond. He was bent over the book, tracing the symbols on the page with a practiced finger. After a long pause, he looked up, his eyes bright with resolve. "We must rebind the force contained in the lighthouse," Holmes explained, his voice steady. "The ritual was meant to trap something, a being, or a force that was too powerful to roam free. Over time, the ritual weakened, and now it threatens to break loose. But by performing a counter-ritual one that mirrors the original, we can seal it once more." I could see Cartwright's brow furrow, his confusion apparent. A counter-ritual? But how? The book doesn't explain how to complete the process, does it? Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "No, it does not. That is the danger we face. But the very fact that we are using the stones, these artifacts, means we are already halfway to completing it. The ritual requires a conduit of sorts, a way to channel the force back into its prison. The stones, I suspect, act as the key to locking it away." I could hear Cartwright's breath quicken as the gravity of the situation settled over him. He'd been trembling before, but now his whole body was stiff with fear. His hands clenched at his sides. "But what if it's too late?" Cartwright asked, his voice shaking. What if the ritual is already unraveling? I felt it, Mr. Holmes. The shadows, the whispers, they've been getting stronger. I don't know if we can stop it. Holmes placed a reassuring hand on Cartwright's shoulder, though his gaze remained fixed on the stones. Fear will not help us, Mr. Cartwright, but action will. We must work quickly before the storm's fury mirrors the chaos breaking free from the ritual. The words seemed to have a calming effect on Cartwright, if only momentarily. He nodded, though I could see that the deep-rooted terror in his eyes had not disappeared. Holmes turned his attention back to the arrangement of the stones. He gently placed the final stone in the center of the chalk circle, ensuring that each one rested precisely where it needed to. Then he opened the book to the crucial page, the one that detailed the ritual. His finger traced the symbols, and he muttered under his breath in a language I did not recognize, a series of incantations that seemed to vibrate in the air around us. I felt a strange stirring in the room, as though the very air had thickened, as though something unseen had begun to move beneath the surface. The wind outside howled even louder, and the lights in the lighthouse flickered violently. The storm was now directly over us, and it seemed as if the tempest was feeding off the ritual itself. The shadows in the room began to shift. "Watson," Holmes said sharply, his eyes fixed on the stones. "Stay close. This may get more dangerous than we expect." I nodded, feeling my heart race as the tension in the room mounted. Cartwright had backed up a few steps, his eyes wide with alarm. The shadows that had once been merely unsettling were now moving with purpose, growing, twisting, and stretching, as if alive. I could feel an oppressive weight pressing down on me, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear. "Holmes," I said, my voice tight with fear. "What's happening? Is this part of the ritual?" Holmes did not look up. "It's the binding, Watson. The force we are attempting to contain is fighting against us, but we must continue. Have no other choice." As Holmes continued, muttering the incantation, the storm outside reached a fever pitch. The wind screamed in the cracks of the lighthouse, and I could see the waves crashing violently against the cliffs below. It was as if nature itself was protesting what we were doing. Yet Holmes remained resolute, his voice unwavering as he continued to chant. Then a low, guttural sound rose from the shadows. It was the kind of noise one might expect from the depths of the earth dark, vibrating, almost alive. The air grew colder, and I felt a creeping sensation along my spine. Something was moving in the room, something invisible, a presence that had taken form in the very fabric of the air. The stones in the circle began to glow faintly, their dark surfaces shimmering with a sickly, greenish light. The symbols on the stones twisted and turned as though they were alive, and the room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I could hear Cartwright breathing heavily behind me, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "It's coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can feel it. It's here." The shadows in the room began to converge, swirling around the stones in a tight spiral. The light in the room flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. A single pulse of light sharp, blinding burst from the center of the circle of stones. The shadows recoiled, and a sharp, otherworldly screech filled the room, reverberating through the very walls of the lighthouse. The force that had been stirring beneath the surface was now fully awake, fighting against the ritual with a primal, terrifying strength. Holmes did not falter. His voice rose above the noise, growing stronger with each word. "We must finish this, Watson. Hold firm." The stones around us began to shake violently, their glowing light flickering like a dying flame. The shadows surged forward, but the stones, now glowing brighter than ever, began to push them back, forcing them into the center of the room. Then, with a final, deafening roar, the stones flared to life, the light burning so brightly that it seemed to fill the entire room. Okay, the shadows evaporated, sucked into the stones as if they were being drawn into a vortex. The force that had once fought so fiercely to escape was now trapped once more, bound by the ritual. For a moment, there was silence. The storm outside began to subside, its fury gradually easing. The wind no longer howled, and the waves calmed. The oppressive weight that had filled the room lifted, and the air seemed to return to normal. It was as if the very essence of the lighthouse had been restored. Holmes stepped back from the circle, his face pale but determined. He looked at Cartwright, who stood frozen, still processing the events he had just witnessed. "It is done," Holmes said quietly. "The ritual has been completed. The force is bound once again." Let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. The air felt lighter, but the weight of what we had just done, what we had just faced, hung heavily in the room. Cartwright's voice broke the silence, shaky but relieved. "It's over," he whispered, almost in disbelief. "It's really over. For now, I thought, but I knew deep down that the mysteries of the lighthouse had only begun to unravel. And though we had contained one dark force, I suspected there would be others waiting in the wings." Chapter 4: The Aftermath. The room was silent now, the storm outside abating with an eerie calm. The sudden stillness left a stark contrast to the chaos we had just endured. The oppressive force that had weighed down upon us, the relentless storm and shadows, had dissipated, vanquished, or so we hoped, by the binding ritual Holmes had guided us through. I stood still for a moment, my mind still processing the events that had unfolded. The lighthouse, which had once felt like a fortress of dread, now seemed almost ordinary. The shadows no longer seemed to shift with malevolent intent. The air, which had been thick with tension, felt light once more. Yet, despite the calm, I couldn't shake the sense that something deeper lay beneath the surface, something that we had only just begun to uncover. Cartwright, still standing near the center of the room, was visibly shaken. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the railing beside him. He had witnessed the culmination of a ritual so ancient and powerful that it seemed to defy all natural law. His grip tightened, and for the first time since our arrival, I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, something that went beyond fear. Relief? Or was it more like resignation? Holmes, too, seemed affected, though he wore his usual calm expression, as though the ordeal had been another puzzle solved. But his eyes were different. They were narrowed, his lips pressed together as though he were holding back a question, a concern that hadn't yet found its way to the surface. "Mr. Cartwright," Holmes said, breaking the silence, "I believe we need to speak." Cartwright nodded, though his voice caught in his throat when he tried to speak. I don't know what to say, Mr. Holmes." "What now? Spores, whatever it was, is contained, but something still doesn't sit right with you, does it?" Holmes interrupted gently, stepping toward him. "You're holding something back. I can see it in your eyes." Cartwright shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Holmes's piercing gaze. "I didn't think you'd notice," he muttered, barely audible. He took a long, deep breath, as if preparing himself to speak the words that had clearly been eating away at him. It's not over, is it? You've sealed it away, yes, but the book, the stones, they're still here. And what happens if they're disturbed again? What if the ritual breaks? What if it comes back stronger?" I looked at Holmes, whose face remained unreadable, though I could sense a slight shift in his posture. He had, after all, been prepared for this moment, prepared for the inevitable question of what came next. "You're right, Cartwright," Holmes said at last, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "The ritual may have been completed for now, but these objects, the stones, the book, they are not to be taken lightly. They contain a power far beyond what we can fully understand. I felt a chill at his words. The weight of the book and the stone still hung heavy in the air, and as I glanced at the symbols on the stones, now resting quietly on the floor, I realized just how little we truly knew about the forces we had dealt with. Holmes turned his gaze back to the stones. It's possible, Mr. Cartwright, that the ritual could be undone if the stones or the book are mishandled. These objects must remain untouched, locked away where they can do no harm. Cartwright nodded, though the look of doubt in his eyes was hard to miss. And if someone finds them, what happens then? Holmes's gaze was unflinching. If anyone disturbs the ritual again, the consequences could be catastrophic. The force we contained is not an entity of flesh and bone, but something far older, far more dangerous. Akaya, it thrives on fear, on uncertainty. If left unchecked, it would break free and wreak havoc. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The implications of Holmes's words were staggering, and as I looked at Cartwright, I could see the same realization creeping into his expression. So, Cartwright said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper, "We can never tell anyone. We can never speak of this. This lighthouse is cursed, isn't it? It will always be tied to whatever was trapped here." Holmes was silent for a long moment before he replied, "In some ways, yes. The curse, if you wish to call it that, will linger as long as the book and the stones are here. This place will never be the same again. Not for you, not for anyone. But it doesn't have to be the end, Mr. Cartwright. You can still live your life, but you must do so with caution." Cartwright's eyes remained locked on the floor, his fingers clenched tightly at his sides. He didn't seem to know how to respond, but the weight of what Holmes had said was clearly sinking in. The lighthouse had become more than just a place. It was now a symbol of the darkness that had been bound within it. And even with the ritual completed, there was no escaping the truth. The past had left its mark on this place, and it could never be erased. "I'll lock it away," Cartwright said finally, his voice steadier now, but still laced with unease. "The book, the stones, they'll be sealed away. I'll make sure no one else can disturb them." "But what about me? What about the others who worked here? Are we safe?" Holmes's gaze softened just slightly. "You are safe, Mr. Cartwright, but only as long as you don't disturb what's been done. The stones must remain untouched, and the book must never be opened again. If anyone else comes here, they must not know what lies beneath. This is a burden you'll carry with you, but one you must bear in silence." Cartwright nodded slowly, though it was clear that the enormity of the responsibility was weighing heavily on him. I could see the lines of stress etched deeper into his face, the knowledge that he now held a dark secret that could never be shared, never be fully understood. Holmes stepped back from the stones and closed the book, carefully placing it on a nearby table. He took a deep breath, his posture finally relaxing as the storm outside finally began to subside. The howling wind had died down to a faint murmur, and the rain, while still falling, had turned to a light drizzle. "It is done," Holmes said quietly, his voice tinged with finality. "For now, at least." But even as he spoke those words, I couldn't shake the sense that the calm we were experiencing was fleeting. The storm outside might have quieted, but something deeper still churned within the lighthouse's walls. The ritual had been completed, yes, but there were still unanswered questions, and I couldn't help but wonder how long this uneasy peace would last. As I turned to Cartwright, I could see the weight of the secret he now carried. The burden of knowing that he had narrowly avoided something far worse than he could have ever imagined. He was no longer just the keeper of the lighthouse. He had become its reluctant guardian, tasked with ensuring that the darkness within it would never be unleashed again. And as the storm outside faded into nothing more than a distant memory, I realized that the true cost of this case had not been the ritual itself, but the toll it had taken on those who had been forced to confront it. The keeper's oath. The night that followed the ritual was one of heavy silence. The storm had fully passed, leaving behind a mist that clung to the landscape like a second skin. The lighthouse, once a place of trepidation and dread, now stood eerily still, its looming form casting a long shadow over the sea below. But, despite the calm, there was an undercurrent of unease, one that seemed to pulse in the very bones of the lighthouse. The ritual had been completed, the dark force bound once more, but a sense of unresolved tension lingered, like a distant rumble of thunder that refuses to dissipate. Cartwright had taken the book and the stones and locked them away in a hidden compartment beneath the floor of the lantern room, his eyes wary as he did so. His hand trembled as he closed the compartment, but he made no move to speak. His silence spoke volumes. He had become the reluctant guardian of a dark secret, a secret that weighed far more heavily on his soul than the solitude of his lighthouse ever could. I had gone to bed that night, feeling drained, the events of the day hanging over me like a cloud, but sleep never came. The constant quiet of the lighthouse felt oppressive now, as though something or someone was watching from the shadows. I could not shake the feeling that we had only just begun to uncover the true extent of the darkness tied to this place. The following morning, the first rays of dawn filtered through the fog, but the air still held a chill. It was as though the lighthouse, despite the clearing of the storm, had retained some of its malice. Holmes and I had breakfast in the small kitchen, though it hardly felt like a morning for reflection. Cartwright had not joined us, and I wondered if he had even slept at all. Holmes was unusually quiet as well, though his mind appeared to be turning over the events of the previous night. I could see the faintest trace of concern on his face, something I had rarely seen. His thoughts were clearly occupied, but whatever it was, he kept it to himself. "Watson," Holmes said, suddenly breaking the silence, "I believe we should speak with Cartwright again. There are details that still remain unclear, and I suspect he may be withholding more than he realizes." I nodded, though I shared a part of Cartwright's hesitation. After everything we had just experienced, I couldn't blame him for holding back. But Holmes was right. There was something gnawing at the edge of the mystery, and we needed answers. We made our way to the lantern room, where Cartwright had retreated. He was standing at the window, staring out over the sea. His face was drawn, and there was a deep weariness in his eyes, one that had not been there before. It seemed the events of the previous night had left more than just physical exhaustion in their wake. Cartwright had been irrevocably changed by what he had witnessed, by what he now knew. "Mr. Cartwright," Holmes said quietly, his voice steady but insistent, "we need to talk." Cartwright didn't turn immediately. He seemed lost in thought, staring at the waves crashing against the rocks far below. When he did finally turn, his face was unreadable, but there was a glimmer of something more in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or fear. "I know what you're going to say," Cartwright said, his voice low. "You think I'm hiding something? You think I know more than I've told you?" Holmes's expression softened slightly. "We are not accusing you of anything, Mr. Cartwright, but we do believe there is something you have not fully disclosed. You were close to the ritual. You were its witness. We need to understand everything, for your sake and for the sake of anyone who may come here after you." Cartwright closed his eyes briefly, as though steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask," he murmured. "But you're right. There's something more, something I couldn't bring myself to speak of before." He walked toward the far corner of the room, where a small chest sat on a shelf. He took a key from his pocket, one that I had not seen before, and unlocked the chest. Inside, there was nothing but a small wooden box, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to mirror those we had seen on the stones. "That box," Cartwright continued, his voice trembling, was left behind by the original keeper of this lighthouse, my great-grandfather. It has been passed down through the generations. I don't know what's inside it, but I always thought it was just a family heirloom. But now I'm not so sure. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the box. Symbols were unlike anything I had seen in the book, though they were similar in their complexity. There was a faint, otherworldly glow to them, just enough to be unsettling. "You've never opened it?" Holmes asked, his voice betraying no hint of surprise. Crichton shook his head, his eyes distant. "No, I was told not to. My grandfather never spoke of it, but he made it clear that it was not for our eyes. He said that when the time came, the one who needed to open it would know. I've never felt that I was the one meant to open it." Holmes studied the box for a long moment before reaching forward. "Then I suppose it's time for someone to open it." Cartwright took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. "Mr. Holmes, I don't know if we should." "The ritual?" Holmes held up a hand to stop him. "The ritual is complete, Cartwright, but we have only just begun to understand what lies beneath. This box may contain the final piece of the puzzle." Reluctantly, Cartwright stepped aside, allowing Holmes to carefully open the box. It creaked softly as the lid lifted, revealing a single weathered piece of parchment. The paper was old, the edges frayed, and the ink faded. But there was one symbol that stood out from the rest: a large, intricately drawn circle, surrounded by smaller symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint glow. Holmes took the parchment in his hands, his eyes scanning the text. His expression remained unchanged, but I could see the shift in his posture as he absorbed the meaning of the words. "This," Holmes said slowly, "is a map to something deeper, something hidden beneath the lighthouse. I was right. This place is more than just a lighthouse. It's a key to a much older, more complex system." A T stepped closer. My curiosity piqued. "A map? To what?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes were still fixed on the parchment, his fingers tracing the lines of the symbols as though they held some deeper meaning. Finally, he looked up, meeting Cartwright's gaze. "You've kept this secret for a reason, Mr. Cartwright," Holmes said softly. "But now we must uncover what lies beneath. There are more questions to answer in this box. This map will lead us to them." Cartwright, for the first time since we had met him, looked uncertain. "I thought we were done. I thought we sealed it away." "We did," Holmes replied. "The true nature of the lighthouse and what it guards remains to be seen." I glanced at the box again, the symbols faintly glowing, as if beckoning us to look deeper. Cartwright's grandfather had left behind. It was clear now that the mystery of the lighthouse was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. Chapter 5. The descent below. The discovery of the map within the box had shifted something in the atmosphere of the lighthouse. The air, once thick with the aftermath of the binding ritual, now seemed to hum with an unseen energy, as though the very walls of the lighthouse were alive, holding their breath, waiting for what was to come next. Holmes was absorbed in studying the parchment, his eyes tracing the unfamiliar symbols with an intensity that suggested the map held far more than just a path to a hidden chamber. It was a key to understanding the full extent of what had been buried beneath the lighthouse. I could see the gears turning in his mind, the way his brow furrowed as he pieced together the elements of the puzzle. Cartwright, too, was watching intently, his face a mask of uncertainty and dread. The weight of the discovery was evident in his every movement. He had not anticipated this. None of us had. As Holmes finally set the map down, his fingers lingering on the edge of the parchment. "This map," he said slowly, "is more than just a guide. It marks a series of passages beneath the lighthouse and underground network of rooms and corridors. There is something here, something that goes far beyond the ritual we've completed." Cartwright's face went pale. "Underground?" I don't know of any passages beneath the lighthouse. There's nothing on the property that even hints at such a thing. Holmes glanced at him, his expression unreadable. That may be true, Mr. Cartwright, but the map is unmistakable. These symbols and lines lead directly below us. If we follow the path indicated here, we will find the heart of the mystery that has plagued this place. The sound of the wind outside howled once more, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room. The sense of finality that had seemed to settle over the lighthouse after the ritual now felt premature. I felt an unease in my stomach, a creeping sensation that the real story, the one we had not yet uncovered, was still hidden deep beneath our feet. "You're suggesting we go down there?" I asked, my voice tinged with skepticism. Holmes nodded. "We have no choice, Watson. The lighthouse is not what it appears to be. There is a deeper purpose to it, one tied to these symbols, to the ritual, and to the force we've only just contained. Whatever lies beneath this place is the true origin of the disturbances we've experienced." I turned to look at Cartwright, who seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant. He had been a part of this mystery from the start, but now, faced with the idea of venturing into the very heart of the unknown, I could see that he was beginning to question whether he had made the right decision in calling for our help. "We don't know what we're going to find down there," Cartwright said quietly. What if we're opening something that should stay closed?" Holmes met his gaze with calm assurance. "We've already done what needed to be done. The ritual was necessary, but it was not the final step. This is the last piece of the puzzle. If we leave it untouched, we risk inviting the very danger we sought to contain." "I believe this is what your grandfather feared, what he tried to protect you from." Cartwright shuddered at the mention of his grandfather, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. "He never told me any of this. He said there were things about this place, things that could never be explained, but I never knew it was like this." Holmes placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late to take control of this, Mr. Cartwright. We do it together. We'll uncover the truth once and for all." Cartwright took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "I suppose there's no turning back now." With that, we made our way to the staircase that led down to the lower levels of the lighthouse, the map in Holmes's hand guiding our steps. The stairwell, narrow and winding, seemed to stretch endlessly as we descended deeper into the bowels of the lighthouse. Each step we took felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the sense that we were being drawn into something far darker than anything we had yet encountered. At the bottom of the stairs, the air grew colder. The walls were damp with the moisture of the sea, and a musty scent filled the air. The stone underfoot felt slick, and the faintest echo of dripping water reverberated in the distance to us, as though we had stepped into a place forgotten by time, a place that had not seen daylight for centuries. Holmes paused at the base of the stairs, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "The map leads us to this chamber, but there is something we can't yet see." I stepped forward, the faint light from our lantern casting long shadows on the walls. As I walked, I noticed a slight indentation in the stone floor, a faint outline of a trapdoor that seemed to have been hidden for years. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, just waiting to be discovered. "Holmes, look," I said, pointing to the floor. Holmes knelt beside the trapdoor, his hands tracing the outline. "This is it," he said quietly. "The entrance to whatever lies beneath." Cartwright stepped forward, his face drawn with apprehension. "Are you sure this is it? This is where the map leads." Holmes nodded. "The map shows us this location, but there is more. The symbols we've seen before, the ones on the stones, they're here too, embedded in the walls and floor. This is the heart of the lighthouse, where the ritual was meant to converge." With a steady hand, Holmes began to press on the stone, testing its resistance. There was a slight creak, and then the stone shifted, revealing a narrow passage below. The air that emerged from the opening was thick and stale, carrying with it the smell of ancient decay. It was as though we had opened a door to a world that had been sealed away for far too long. "Shall we?" Holmes asked, his eyes meeting mine. I hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Let's see this through." Cartwright stood back, his hands pressed together in a silent prayer, his eyes filled with the fear that spoke of the deep, spoken knowledge that we were on the verge of uncovering something far darker than we could have ever imagined. Holmes descended first, his lantern casting its warm light on the walls of the narrow passage. The air was thick with dust, and the stone beneath our feet seemed to groan with every step, as though the structure was waking from a long, uneasy slumber. I followed closely behind, with Cartwright bringing up the rear. As we descended further, the passage began to widen, revealing the cavernous space beneath the lighthouse. I couldn't shake the feeling that the very earth we stood on was alive, pulsing with an ancient energy that had been dormant for centuries. And as the passage opened up into a large chamber, I felt the unmistakable sense of something waiting. In the dark, something that had been waiting for us all along. The Chamber of Secrets, the chamber we entered, was unlike any space I had ever seen. The walls, carved from the solid stone of the lighthouse foundation, were covered in strange carvings and symbols, their meanings impossible to decipher. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and decay, and the ground beneath our feet seemed unnaturally cold, even for a place so near the sea. The lantern's glow barely reached the far corners of the room, and the shadows seemed to stretch impossibly long, as if the darkness itself was waiting for us to disturb its peace. Holmes stepped forward cautiously, his gaze sweeping over the room as if measuring it, absorbing every detail, every nuance of the space. His face was impassive, though his eyes flickered with a familiar gleam of curiosity, the same gleam I had seen countless times before. Whenever he had uncovered a mystery that threatened to stretch beyond the limits of his understanding. This chamber, with its ancient symbols and palpable sense of dread, was clearly no ordinary place. Whatever lay within this space was more than just the culmination of the strange occurrences at the lighthouse. It was the heart of the mystery itself. Cartwright had not moved from the entrance, his face pale and drawn with fear. He stood frozen, as if the room itself had become too much to bear. This place," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I don't remember seeing it. I don't remember my grandfather ever mentioning anything like this." Holmes gave him a measured glance, his voice calm yet urgent. "Your grandfather likely kept it from you. Whatever is hidden here was meant to be concealed, its existence, its purpose, all hidden away to keep it from reaching the surface." Cartwright's eyes widened as he absorbed Holmes's words. Hidden? But why? What could be so dangerous that he would keep it from me? From my family? Holmes hesitated for a moment, then turned back to face the chamber. "It's not just dangerous, Mr. Cartwright. It's something far more insidious. A force bound here long ago, and your grandfather likely understood the danger of what lies beneath this lighthouse. But now we must face it." I felt a chill run down my spine at the implications of Holmes's words. I had known for some time that the lighthouse held secrets, dark, ancient secrets, but to hear Holmes speak of it in such a direct manner, to hear him refer to whatever lay within this chamber as a force rather than a mere mystery, gave me pause. This was no longer just a case. This was something far more primal, something tied to the very essence of this place. As I surveyed the room, I noticed something else. An altar at the far end of the chamber. This was made of the same rough stone as the walls, but it was covered in strange, faded markings that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Around it were scattered remnants of what appeared to be old, forgotten rituals, cracked clay vessels, faded offerings. and fragments of something that had once been inscribed with symbols now lost to time. Holmes moved toward the altar, his gaze fixed intently on the markings. As he drew closer, his expression shifted slightly, his brow furrowing with both recognition and concern. "Watson, look at this," he called over his shoulder. I joined him quickly, my heart pounding as I took in the sight of the altar. At its center was a small stone basin, now cracked and empty, but its surface still marked with ancient symbols. A small, dark stain remained at the bottom, an eerie reminder of what had once been placed there. Surrounding the altar were 4 stone pillars, each engraved with the same strange symbols we had seen in the book, and on the stones, the same markings that had been the key to the ritual that had bound the force beneath the lighthouse. "This is where the original ritual must have taken place," Holmes said, his voice low. "Okay. The altar was the focal point. Okay. This is where the force was contained. These pillars," he gestured to the tall stone columns, "likely acted as the anchors to bind whatever dark power was trapped here." I could feel the weight of Holmes's words. The ritual, the binding, the force, it was all part of a larger, more complex system than I had imagined. We had thought the ritual was complete, that we had sealed the force away for good. But now, standing in the heart of the chamber, I began to wonder if there was more we had missed. Had we truly done enough to contain it? As if reading my thoughts, Holmes turned to face me. "The ritual we performed, Watson, was not the end of the story. It was a necessary step, but there is still much we don't understand. This chamber, this altar, holds the key to what has been happening. But there is more here, more beneath the surface." I swallowed hard. "More? What do you mean?" Holmes gestured to the pillars. "These stones, these symbols, they were part of the original containment. But the force is not a mere presence. It is a living thing, something that feeds on fear, on energy, on the passage of time. We may have contained it, but it is still here, in the very walls of this place." Cartwright stepped forward, his expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You mean it's not over? You're saying we haven't finished it?" Holmes's gaze was steady. "No, Mr. Cartwright, the force is still here. It is bound, but it is not gone. In the ritual we performed last night, though it may have sealed, it, for now, has only bought us time, to understand what truly lies beneath." There was a moment of silence as Cartwright absorbed Holmes's words. The weight of what we were facing was heavy, and I could see that Cartwright was struggling to come to terms with the truth. For years, he had lived in this lighthouse, unaware of the dark secret hidden within its walls. Now, with that secret laid bare, he was forced to confront the fact that the battle was far from over. I turned back to the altar, my mind racing as I thought through the implications of what Holmes had said. "So, what do we do now? How do we keep it contained?" Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he slowly approached the altar, his fingers brushing the faded symbols etched into the stone. "We must complete the ritual fully, make sure the binding is stronger than before. The force here was never truly bound, it was only contained. And now, with the map and the book, we have the tools to finish what was started." I watched as Holmes took a deep breath, his hands tracing the markings on the altar as if seeking something, some hidden truth that would lead us to the next step. The air in the chamber grew heavier as the reality of our task set in. Whatever force had been contained here was no ordinary entity, was something that defied understanding, something that had been waiting for centuries. "Let's begin," Holmes said, his voice calm but resolute. And so we prepared to descend deeper into the mystery of the lighthouse, to confront whatever lay beneath its hand, to ensure that whatever power had once been bound here would never be allowed to break free again. Chapter 6. The heart of the lighthouse. The chamber seemed to breathe with us. the air thick with ancient energies that rippled through the room. As we stood before the altar, its carvings now casting long shadows that seemed to shift as if alive, I could feel the gravity of the task ahead pressing down upon me. Holmes's voice, steady and calm, echoed in the oppressive silence, his every word laden with urgency. "We have everything we need, Watson. The ritual is not complete. But this time, we must bind the force more thoroughly, more completely, so it cannot slip through the cracks." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. The ritual we had already performed had served its purpose, but Holmes was right. The force, the entity trapped here so long ago, was not just a presence. It was a living, thinking force of nature that fed on fear, time, and the very essence of the lighthouse itself. It had been contained once, but it was still waiting, and now we had to finish what had been started. Cartwright, standing just a few feet behind us, looked as though he had aged years since we first arrived at the lighthouse. The gravity of the situation had clearly caught up with him. And though his face remained pale and drawn, there was a determination in his eyes. He had already committed to this journey, but I could sense the depths of his anxiety. He was about to become a part of something far larger than he could have ever imagined. "I've always known there was something about this place," Cartwright muttered, his voice tight. "But I never thought it would come to this. I'd be standing here with you, completing something that should have stayed buried." Holmes glanced at him, his gaze hard and focused. "There is no going back now, Mr. Cartwright. We must finish this. There is a power here beneath the lighthouse that has already begun to stir. If we leave it unchecked, it will break free, and the consequences could be far worse than you imagine." Cartwright swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the lantern in his hand. "And if we fail, what then?" Holmes didn't hesitate. "We won't fail." There was a finality in his words that left no room for doubt. Holmes was resolute, his mind already moving forward, processing the ritual, the symbols, and the forces at play. He came back to the altar, his eyes scanning the carvings once again as if seeking something new. I followed his gaze, but the symbols on the stone remained just as inscrutable as they had before. They were ancient, beyond our understanding, yet I could feel their weight, as if the very stone beneath our feet was alive with the memory of what had happened here centuries ago. "This place," Holmes said quietly, almost to himself, "was never just a lighthouse. It was a prison built not to guide ships, but to contain something far darker." I stood, silently, absorbing his words, my mind racing. We had already faced the unknown, encountered the shadows, heard the whispers. But this was something deeper, something far more ancient and powerful. And now we were about to confront it head on. Holmes stepped forward, closer to the altar, and began to trace the symbols etched into the stone with his fingers. As his hand moved across the carvings, I saw a subtle change in the air around us, a flicker, a pulse, as though the chamber itself was responding to his touch. The stones hummed softly, and for a moment I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me. Of the ancient ritual that had once bound the force, now reverberating through the walls. "We have to synchronize the energy," Holmes explained, his voice calm despite the intensity of the moment. "The ritual was incomplete because it lacked a final catalyst. This catalyst will be the final binding. Without it, the force remains in a state of flux." Cartwright stepped forward, his face etched with uncertainty. "And how do we do that? How do we make sure it doesn't break free again?" Holmes didn't look up. "We need to channel the energy of the power of the lighthouse, of the force itself, and bind it more tightly than before. The symbols here were designed to capture that energy, but they must be activated in sequence. Only then will the force be truly contained." I stepped closer, watching as Holmes's fingers moved over the altar, tracing the symbols in a deliberate pattern. The air around us seemed to thicken, a low hum vibrating through the walls, as if the very stones were alive with the energy that had once bound the force. The lantern's flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the chamber. "What happens when we finish?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Holmes's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, hint of fear, or perhaps respect. "When we finish, Watson, we will have completed the ritual. But this will not be a simple matter. We are dealing with something that cannot be fully understood by mortal minds. Even now, we are only beginning to scratch the surface of what this force truly is." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I realized that even though we had come so far, there was still much we didn't understand about the entity we were dealing with. It was not just a being or a spirit. It was a force, something ancient, older than anything we had encountered before. Holmes turned to face Cartwright. "We need your help, right? You must help me activate the final part of the ritual." Cartwright nodded, though his face was pale with fear. "What do I have to do?" Holmes gestured to the altar. "You will stand beside me. Together, we will channel the energy through the symbols, drawing upon the power of the lighthouse, of the force, and bind it more tightly than before. Only then can we seal it." Cartwright hesitated, but after a long moment, he stepped forward, taking his place beside Holmes at the altar. The two of them stood side by side, hands raised, fingers tracing the symbols on the stone. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, as if the force within was waiting for its final moment of reckoning. Holmes turned to me, his gaze steady. "Stay alert, Watson. This is the final step. We cannot afford any distractions." I nodded, my heart pounding as I stepped back to watch, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. I could sense the energy building, the hum of power vibrating in the very air. The force we had contained, the entity we had sought to bind, was growing restless once again. The room was silent, save for the sound of our breathing, and the air around us seemed to tremble with anticipation. Then, without warning, Holmes and Cartwright both raised their hands, their fingers tracing the final symbols in unison. The sound of the force, deep and guttural, rose from the stones beneath us, a low rumble that vibrated through the chamber. A flash of light filled the room, bright and blinding, and I had to shield my eyes against the intensity of it. The symbols on the altar began to glow, their light growing brighter with each passing moment. The air crackled with energy, and I could feel the ground beneath my feet tremble. The force was pushing back, resisting the binding, but Holmes and Cartwright held firm, their hands moving in time with the symbols, channeling the energy into the altar. The force surged, and for a moment, it seemed as though the room might collapse under the pressure. But then, with a final, deafening roar, the light exploded outward, and the room went silent. The force was contained. For now, the calm after. The storm, the chamber, was silent. For a long moment, nothing moved. The tension that had filled the air for what seemed like an eternity began to dissipate, replaced by a thick, suffocating stillness. The blinding light that had flooded the room faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the faint glow of the altar's symbols, now dimming and flickering like a dying flame. Holmes and Cartwright stood motionless, their hands still raised, but their movements had slowed. The energy that had once surged through them was now gone, leaving only a faint hum reverberating through the stone walls. I stood there, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest, still struggling to process the intensity of what we had just experienced. The air in the room had shifted lighter, though still thick with the residue of something far more powerful. It had been done. The ritual, at last, was complete. Holmes lowered his hand first, his fingers curling into a fist as if he were still clutching the last remnants of the power we had just channeled. Cartwright followed suit, his face pale and drawn, but his expression was one of disbelief, as though he had just emerged from a dream or a nightmare. "It's over," Cartwright said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He sounded almost relieved, yet there was an undercurrent of doubt in his words, as though he couldn't quite believe what had just transpired. "The force, it's really gone?" Holmes stepped away from the altar, his gaze scanning the room. He seemed detached, absorbed in the aftermath of the ritual. His brow furrowed as he examined the symbols now etched into the stone, their glow fading, leaving only faint traces of light in the air. The altar, once an ominous centerpiece of the chamber, now seemed like an ordinary structure, devoid of any power. "It's not gone," Holmes said, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of caution. "It's contained, but not destroyed. There is a difference, Cartwright. What we've done here is bind it once again, but we must remain vigilant. The force is still present, and it will always be tied to this place." Cartwright swallowed hard, the weight of Holmes's words sinking in. "You mean it could come back?" "Yes," Holmes replied simply, his tone serious. "But not unless something disturbs the containment. We've done what was necessary, but this place, this lighthouse, it will always be tied to that force. The power we've sealed is not easily vanquished, will only remain dormant as long as we take care to protect it." I could see the burden of Holmes's words pressing down on Cartwright. The lighthouse keeper had not only been forced to confront the terrifying truths of his inheritance, but he had also become its reluctant guardian. He had agreed to help us perform the ritual, but in doing so, he had inherited a responsibility far greater than any of us had anticipated. I understand," Cartwright said, his voice wavering slightly. "But what do we do now? What happens to the lighthouse?" "To me?" Holmes paused, considering the question carefully. "You can never leave this place, Mr. Cartwright. At least, not for long. As long as the ritual is in place, you must remain its keeper, its guardian. You must ensure that no one disturbs the seals we've placed here. The stones, the book, everything must remain untouched, and you must never speak of what you've learned to anyone." Cartwright nodded, his face a mask of resignation. "I knew it. I knew the lighthouse wasn't just a place. I knew there was something wrong with it, something I couldn't explain. But I never imagined it would be something like this." Holmes's eyes softened, just for a moment. "No one would. The truth of this place is not something anyone could fathom, not even those who lived here. Your grandfather understood the danger of what lay beneath, and he did what he could to keep it locked away. Now it is your turn." I watched Cartwright's face as the realization sank in. His life, his future, had been irrevocably changed. What had once been a simple lighthouse, a quiet place by the sea, was now a prison for something far darker. The burden was his to bear, and he knew it. "What about us?" I asked, my voice carrying a mix of uncertainty and weariness. "What happens to us now that the ritual is complete?" Holmes turned to face me, his expression thoughtful. "We return to London, Watson. We've done our part. We've ensured that the force is contained, and now we must leave it in Cartwright's hands. But we cannot forget what we've learned here. The lighthouse and the power within it is a story that doesn't end with us." I nodded, understanding what he meant. The mystery of the lighthouse was over, at least for now, but its legacy would linger. There would be no forgetting the darkness we had uncovered, nor the sense of foreboding that still clung to this place like a thick fog. I looked back at Cartwright, who was standing motionless by the altar, his eyes fixed on the symbols fading into the stone. The force had been bound, but Cartwright's life would now be tied to the lighthouse. to its secrets, to the power that we had sealed within its walls. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing and the distant rumble of the waves crashing against the cliffs below. The weight of what we had done, of what we had witnessed, hung heavily in the air. "Are you ready, Mr. Cartwright?" Holmes asked, breaking the silence. Cartwright turned to face him, his gaze steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "I suppose there's no turning back now." Holmes nodded, his expression softening. "There's no easy way to face what's ahead, but you've done what needed to be done. And now it's time to move forward." I could see that Cartwright was still processing the enormity of the responsibility he had inherited. He was no longer just the keeper of the lighthouse. He was its protector, its silent guardian, holding the secrets of a force that had shaped this place for centuries. As we made our way out of the chamber and back up the narrow staircase, I couldn't help but glance back at the darkened altar, the faded symbols, and the dim glow that still lingered in the air. The lighthouse was calm now, but I knew that beneath the surface, something ancient and dangerous still waited, bound but not defeated. We stepped into the daylight, the fresh air carrying with it the promise of a new day. But the shadows of the lighthouse would remain with us, constant reminder of the secrets that lay buried beneath the surface, waiting for someone to uncover them again. And as Cartwright locked the door to the lighthouse's hidden chamber behind us, I knew that whatever lay ahead, it would be impossible to forget what we had discovered. Chapter 7 A. Lingering darkness. The journey back to London felt strange, almost surreal, as if the world had shifted ever so slightly, just enough for me to notice the cracks beneath its surface. The lighthouse was behind us, hidden once more in the thick mist, but the events that had unfolded there seemed to cling to me, their weight heavier with each passing mile. We traveled in silence for most of the trip. Holmes was deep in thought, his brow furrowed in concentration as he stared out of the window, his mind undoubtedly piecing together the fragments of the mystery that still lingered in the shadows. Cartwright sat across from us, his face a mask of exhaustion, though there was something else in his eyes, a quiet resolve, a recognition that the life he had known was gone forever. He would never be the same after what he had witnessed beneath the lighthouse. I glanced at him several times during the journey, wondering how he could possibly carry the burden of what he now knew. The force had been bound, but the knowledge of what lay beneath would never leave him. He was no longer just the keeper of a lighthouse. He was its guardian, bound to a place of secrets and ancient power, a silent witness to the darkness that still lurked beneath the surface. "You're quiet, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Something on your mind?" I looked at him, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "Stinking," I replied, my voice subdued. "It doesn't feel over, does it? We sealed the force away, but something about it doesn't sit right with me." The darkness beneath the lighthouse sits still there, lurking in the corners, waiting for a crack in the seal. Holmes glanced at me, his gaze thoughtful. "You're right, Watson. It's never truly over. The ritual has bound the force for now, but the nature of such a power is not easily contained. It may remain dormant for years, decades even, but I have no doubt that the lighthouse will continue to hold its secrets. The danger may not be immediate, but the potential for something to disturb the seal is always present." I let out a sigh, the weight of his words settling heavily on my chest. We had done what we could, and yet I felt as though we had merely paused the inevitable. There was still a part of me that wondered if, someday, the force would break free again, or if someone else would uncover the truth and unwittingly release it once more. The idea that the lighthouse would remain a silent keeper of darkness, buried beneath layers of history and secrecy, made me uneasy. "We should prepare for the possibility," Holmes continued, his voice steady and resolute. "The ritual was not perfect, Watson. There are always variables, forces beyond our understanding that we cannot account for. Okay? We may have bound the force, but we've only bought time. It's time to prepare, time to understand more of what we're truly dealing with. I nodded, though I still felt the sting of uncertainty. And Cartwright? What happens to him? Holmes shifted his gaze toward the window, his expression thoughtful. Cartwright will remain at the lighthouse, of course. He must. The task he has now is not one that can be handed over lightly. He is its guardian, whether he wishes it or not. It is a lonely, isolating duty, but one that must be fulfilled. I glanced at Cartwright, who was staring out of the window, his eyes distant. I could see the burden in his posture, the weight of responsibility that had been thrust upon him. He would never be able to escape the darkness that lingered in the lighthouse, nor the truth of what lay beneath it. He had inherited a legacy far darker than any of us had anticipated. I didn't ask for this, Cartwright said, suddenly, his voice low but firm. But now that it's done, I have no choice. I'm tied to that place, aren't I? Holmes nodded, slowly, his gaze unwavering. Yes, the lighthouse is yours to protect, Mr. Cartwright. Your life has changed forever. But you will never be alone in this. You have the knowledge to protect it, to keep the seal intact. And you will always have the option of calling on us if the need arises. Cartwright didn't respond immediately, but I could see the weight of Holmes's words sinking in. He had already made his choice, whether he realized it or not. His future, his path, would always be tied to the lighthouse and the darkness it held. He had become its reluctant keeper, its silent guardian. The rest of the journey passed in a quiet daze. The city of London came into view as we neared the outskirts, its skyline looming in the distance, a stark contrast to the isolation of the lighthouse. I couldn't help but feel that we were leaving something important behind, something that would continue to affect us, even if we couldn't see it. The mystery of the lighthouse was not over, but it had changed, shifted into something deeper, something that we could never truly leave behind. When we finally arrived back at our Baker Street lodgings, Holmes immediately began pacing, his mind clearly racing as he thought over the case. I, on the other hand, felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. The days spent at the lighthouse, the ritual, the forced had all taken a toll on me, and I needed time to process everything. But Holmes was already planning ahead, already thinking about the next steps, Watson, he said, pausing in front of me, we must keep an eye on the lighthouse. The ritual has been completed for now, but we cannot afford to be complacent. Cartwright will need our assistance if anything goes wrong. I nodded, though a part of me longed for the comfort of normalcy. The world seemed to have shifted beneath my feet, and I wasn't sure where we stood anymore. We had faced something far beyond our understanding, something that had changed, not just Cartwright, but all of us. Holmes returned to his desk, his mind already turning over new theories and possibilities. I sat back in my chair, reflecting on the events of the past few days. I had seen the dark underbelly of the world, things that defied logic, things that could not be explained. And now, with the lighthouse sealed away, I found myself wondering what other mysteries awaited us, lurking just beneath the surface of reality. The storm may have passed, but the darkness beneath the lighthouse had not vanished. It was still there, waiting. And no matter how much we tried to leave it behind, it would always be a part of us. A shadow in the distance. The weeks following our return to London passed slowly, like the fading echoes of a storm long gone. The city's bustle, its incessant movement, had a strange way of making the extraordinary feel mundane. It was almost as if the events of the lighthouse were a dream, something distant, something that had happened to another version of myself. Yet, as I sat in my usual armchair by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to surface. Holmes had thrown himself back into his work, as he always did. After a case, but there was an odd sense of quiet in the air. His usual energy, the spark that often burned in his eyes when he was chasing a lead or piecing together a mystery, was subdued. He seemed preoccupied, as though something just beyond his grasp was demanding his attention. I noticed the subtle signs. His restlessness, his eyes that would drift toward the window, as if he could see something out there in the distance that none of us could. It was late one evening, a particularly cold autumn night, when the calm finally broke. Holmes had been pacing the room for what seemed like hours, his mind working over something in his usual meticulous fashion. I had long since abandoned my attempts at reading and had been watching him quietly, waiting for him to speak, as I knew he eventually would. "It's time," Holmes said suddenly, turning toward me, his voice low but urgent. "I cannot ignore this any longer, Watson. The lighthouse is still a threat, and I fear it has begun to stir once again." I felt a sudden tightness in my chest. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that once we left the lighthouse, the case would be behind us, a chapter closed. But as Holmes's words sank in, I understood that our actions had not sealed away the danger for good. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. Holmes stood still for a moment, his gaze fixed on something unseen, as though he were searching for the right words. "The force beneath the lighthouse, while bound, is not dormant. It has not vanished. I've been monitoring the situation, and I've noticed changes. Subtle, yes, but they are there. It is only a matter of time before someone or something disrupts the seal we placed." Kay stood up, crossing the room to stand beside him. "So, you're saying it's not over? That the danger still exists?" Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "The ritual we performed was merely a temporary measure, Watson. The force within the lighthouse is ancient, and its power cannot be easily erased. It is waiting, biding its time, but it will not remain contained forever. We've only delayed the inevitable." "Okay." The weight of his words settled over me like a fog, and I felt a deep sense of unease rising in my chest. We had thought the worst was behind us, that the force had been contained. But now I realized we had only placed a fragile barrier between ourselves and something far more dangerous than we had understood. "Do you think Cartwright is in danger?" I asked, my thoughts turning immediately to the lighthouse keeper. He had been left with the responsibility of guarding the seal, but had we truly left him prepared for what lay ahead? Holmes's gaze softened, but there was a hardness to it that betrayed the gravity of the situation. "I fear for him. He is not trained for this. He does not understand the full weight of what he is guarding. And while he may be physically present at the lighthouse, it is not enough to keep the force contained. The rituals we performed are not infallible. We must return to ensure the safety of both Cartwright and the lighthouse." I nodded, my mind racing as I considered our options. I had hoped we could move on from this mystery, that the horror of the lighthouse would remain confined to the past. But now I understood that it was far from over. We had left a loose thread, and I could feel it pulling at me. "When do we leave?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Holmes did not hesitate. "Tonight? Cannot afford to waste any more time." The journey back to the lighthouse was long, the landscape growing increasingly desolate as we approached the coast. The sky above was heavy with clouds, and the air was damp with the promise of another storm. The closer we got to the lighthouse, the more I could feel the weight of the place bearing down on me, as though it were drawing us back into its dark embrace. As we neared the lighthouse, Holmes remained quiet, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert to any sign of disturbance. His mind was already working ahead, thinking through the possibilities. I, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of dread. The force had not been eradicated. Kit had merely been put to sleep, and we were about to disturb its slumber once again. When we finally arrived at the lighthouse, I noticed immediately that something was different. The air felt charged, the silence broken only by the occasional crash of waves against the rocks. But there was a stillness to the place that felt unnatural. The lighthouse, though standing tall and proud, seemed somehow diminished, as if it were waiting for something or someone. Cartwright was standing at the door, his figure framed by the dim light coming from within. His face was drawn, and there was a look of uncertainty in his eyes as he saw us approach. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice quiet but filled with an undercurrent of relief, "I'm glad you're here." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze steady. "We must move quickly, Mr. Cartwright. The force within the lighthouse is stirring once again. We need to reinforce the seal and ensure that it remains contained." Cartwright nodded, though his expression was a mixture of confusion and fear. "I've been trying to keep the place as secure as I can, but I'm not sure how to." "You've done well so far," Holmes interrupted, his tone firm but reassuring. "Now we must finish what we started." As we stepped into the lighthouse, I could feel the oppressive atmosphere tightening around us. The familiar sounds of the wind and waves had a hollow quality now, as though they, too, were aware of the darkness that still lingered. The ritual had been completed, but the air itself felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Holmes led the way to the lantern room, his every step measured, deliberate. I followed closely behind, with Cartwright trailing nervously. The altar, the symbols, the stones, they were all still in place. But there was a subtle shift in the air, an undercurrent of something lurking just out of sight. I could feel it, a creeping sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. The force beneath this place had not been sealed away forever, and the walls of the lighthouse seemed to pulse with that knowledge. Holmes paused before the altar, his hands resting on the stone as he surveyed the room. "The ritual must be reinforced," he said quietly. "We cannot allow it to unravel." I looked at Cartwright, who stood still, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and realization. The burden had fallen on him, and it was clear he was beginning to understand the full extent of the danger that still remained. "Ready, Mr. Cartwright?" Holmes asked, his voice low. Cartwright nodded, though I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He had never asked for this, never wanted it, but now it was his responsibility. He was tied to this place, tied to its dark secret, and he had no choice but to face it. The time had come to reinforce the sea land. We had no idea how long it would hold.